one of the things we've added to our arsenal is we don't just block the numbers when they hit consumers. We now go work with carriers so that they can stop the people who are making the calls in the first place. And so it used to be a person could make millions and millions and millions of robocalls and get away with it. Now, if they make millions of robocalls, they're going to hit our users. We're going to recognize what they're doing. If their carrier is a partner of ours, we're going to tell that carrier, and the carrier is going to shut them off. And so that's the key thing in the arms race, is not let the bad guys get started. Once they get started and they make tons of calls, everybody's effective. If you can stop them after 1,000 calls or 10,000 calls, it's still a lot, but it's not 10 million calls or 100 million calls.
How did you get started on this?
So YouMail is an interesting company. We originally started off as a voicemail company with the idea that we could do a better job of voicemail than the carriers. And we could hopefully convince the carriers to use our service, right? So we could sell to the carriers and get huge scale and change voicemail. It turned out that wasn't a bad idea, but what came out of all that, because it wasn't really successful as a voicemail company, was we collected a tremendous amount of data. And the data was the audio patterns that the fraudsters and the spammers and the scammers leave. So essentially the audience we built up with our voicemail app had become a sensor network. And so from there, we had the data that enables us to determine if phone numbers are misbehaving, block them, provide information to carriers to help them figure out who their customer is that's doing this, and clean up the phone network. And so that's how YouMail got to be the Communicate Safely app that we are now. It was kind of a pivot from let's become a great voicemail app.
Well, and that's awesome. And for the founders that listen to us, I'm going to come back maybe to some of what you were seeing that led you to pivot there. But it's funny. In the good old days of, I think, Google Voice, I can't even remember when it first came out, right? But it was this amazing tool that also happened to collect an enormous amount of data on voice patterns, how people interact, things like that powered services. I feel like it sounds like you kind of stumbled into the Google Voice of dark patterns. And we're able to do something kind of interesting with it.
And the stumbling was due to consumers. So in our voicemail service that we did, one of the coolest features we had was you could play an out of service greeting to a particular phone number. So we used to call that the hookup defender. So you gave out your number in a bar, you decide, oops, that was a mistake. Now when they call you, they get an out of service message. Yeah. So it turned out, though, that while that was a use case, it's not the main use case. The main use case was people were playing that to 1-800 numbers. The same people were playing it to the same number, right? So across huge numbers of our users, we realized YouMail is being used as a call blocker to make bad guys go away, whatever your definition of bad guy was. That's how we ended up realizing our data was so valuable, because we said, well, how do we solve the problem? We could look at patterns. Like, here's a number that calls everybody. It's blocked a lot. Let's block it automatically. We started that way, but then we realized, hey, if we knew the content, the voicemail that was left by the spammer, we can see all the phone numbers that are getting that voicemail or calling from that voicemail, calling from that number, and then start blocking it, right? So pattern match and be able to stop the calls from a wide range of numbers that are doing this behavior. Yeah. And so that created something called content-based blocking, content-based analytics. And so we evolved. It was a mix of consumers telling us, hey, your app's actually really good for this. And then us saying, how do we do it better? And what do we have that enables us to do that?
Well, I love everything I'm hearing, because one, like, this tight loop between what your customers are doing and what they're telling you directly and indirectly and your business decision. I mean, that is clearly a pattern that helps founders be successful. And so I love kind of hearing that right from the voice of a founder. But the other interesting thing is, as you moved from what was a very simple very simple heuristic or very simple set of analysis, hey, like, a lot of people have reported this as a bad number, maybe we should block it. You really upped the level of sophistication, and you entered in a little bit of an arms race. How's that arms race going for those of us that receive spam texts and calls these days?
Well, I think it's going reasonably well, because one of the things we've added to our arsenal is we don't just block the numbers when they hit consumers. We now go work with carriers so that they can stop the people who are making the calls in the first place. And so it used to be a person could make millions and millions and millions of robocalls and get away with it.
Yeah.
Now, if they make millions of robocalls, they're going to hit our users. We're going to recognize what they're doing. If their carrier is a partner of ours, we're going to tell that carrier, and the carrier is going to shut them off. And so that's the key thing in the arms race, is not let the bad guys get started. Once they get started and they make tons of calls, there's, everybody's effective. If you can stop them after 1,000 calls or 10,000 calls, it's still a lot, but it's not 10 million calls or 100 million calls.
Yeah. So we were talking very briefly before we started recording this morning about the increasingly rapid pace of change in the world, right? And so we're living in a world where AI has been in the headlines largely due to generative AI and things like that all the time for the last couple of years. How is this changing some of what you're doing? 11 Labs, probably my favorite voice generation service, just launched an iOS app today, and it's just a screen reader, but like this is lifelike voice, potentially off of digitally generated AI text. Is this making it more difficult for you to, get in front of and detect malicious patterns in communications?
I think it's a challenge, but we've been pretty successful so far. So, for example, there was a deep fake of Joe Biden in New Hampshire in February. We detected that within an hour and had sent examples to law enforcement. And so, that one ended pretty quickly. And I think it's, the person's going to have to pay fines and the carrier's paying fines. It's all good. So I think it's just adding to our challenges, but I think we're up to it.
Yeah. Well, that's reassuring. As much fun as I actually do have engaging with the lost number texts that I get occasionally, it's like sometimes it's just a good time. That is reassuring. You said something else interesting there, though. You talked about law enforcement, and you talked about a regulatory framework that might impose fines, things like that. How important are these externalities for, let's start with YouMail, and then we'll get maybe more broadly to innovation. Like, how important is it to be well connected to a broader kind of legal and enforcement framework for what you're doing?
For what we're doing, it's really important. If we want to stop a campaign at the source, we need to be able to have relationships with the carriers. Yeah. So we need carriers that when we say, hey, this number is misbehaving, they take our evidence, they go, ooh, this number is misbehaving. And they not only block the calls from that number, from being made, but they go, who's my customer? Who's putting those calls in the network? I'm going to block them. So relationships with carriers are critical. Relationship with enforcement, I think, is actually very helpful, because the more enforcement cracks down, the more everybody realizes they've got to do something about the problem, and the more carriers pay attention. And so I think what our role has been was like letting everybody know through our robocall index and variants of it that here's the kinds of robocalls that are out there. Here's the ones that are doing the most damage. Here's the high volume calls. And then law enforcement knows and can make a decision. Where do we want to focus to have the biggest impact? And then they can come to us and we can work with them to give them evidence, and they can use that. And, it kind of goes from there. So one of the things I've learned, it's relationships are critical to a business. I mean, maybe you're Facebook and you can get, billions of people just by virality. Most businesses can't. And so it is key to have relationships to execute on what you want to do and to help you grow.
And so as you were developing these relationships, which are not just personal, but organizational with some, really big public and private sector organizations, what was hard? Did they understand what you were trying to do? And did they understand how their behavior might need to change for the better?
I think it is very hard. And I think what's made us successful is that we're not just dealing with carriers directly. There's a lot of pressure on carriers to clean up their act. For example, there's been law enforcement, the Traced Act, that said you have to authenticate your calls and you have to take action when you have problems. The FCC has done a number of regulatory rulings telling carriers you can't just look the other way. So you can't just block a number, you've got to block the customer and do research and understand what's going on. So that's the framework that then drives interest in our products that we sell to carriers. There's also pressure on carriers from enterprises. So a lot of the fraud that pretends to be a big bank, for example, in a text message or a call, is going through a carrier. It has to.
Sure.
And so the enterprises want the carriers to stop this stuff. And so what's nice about this is, I think you mentioned earlier, it's a problem that affects everybody, which means everybody has an interest in solving it, which puts a lot of pressure on those that are in the path of the bad behavior.